Technicians of Spaceship Earth, welcome to the return of Hawkbinge, your guide to Hawkwind in the 1980s, aka Hawkwind the Thatcher years, as nobody will ever call it again. As ever, you are currently joined by a long-term fan, which is me, and your favourite first-time listener, Matt. Hello, Matt.
Hello, Andy.
It's been a while. You look so much older.
It's been way too long, and yet somehow it doesn't feel like it's been any time now I'm actually looking at you. But I just realised from looking at the correspondence that I've been collecting, getting ready for this show, I started to thank all the people who wished me happy birthday on Facebook, and then I realised that was in May. So yeah, we apologise for the late running of this podcast. Unfortunately, we always say life happens and it gets in the way, but life really happened somehow just in the last few months.
Yeah, well, I'm relieved to see that Hawkwind haven't released another 3 albums in our absence, although I'm told there's one rating to go, so Joe, prepare yourself. Matt, I haven't been able to bring myself to look at the when are you going to record again, where are you, what are you doing messages. So what have you got for us?
So this is going to be like a power fast forward through the last few months. What I have done as a disclaimer is that I'm cherry picking some of the most interesting bits, starting with Rick on YouTube on the Xenon Codex post, who said, "I'm a little surprised that Matt started his overall review with things like probably one of my favourite Hawkwind albums from the decade. He seemed to celebrate it by discounting Chronicle, The Black Sword and Levitation," to which I say, this is why I said one of, but for me, Xenon and Levitation are the ones which definitely excited me most in their entirety, and I think I still stand behind that after taking some time to digest everything. And I know that Black Sword is clearly a favourite with a lot of people. Didn't quite touch me, but considering how good the 70s was, I was still very glad that I can pick a few albums from the 80s and say that I actually really like them, and have definitely deepened my experience of listening to the band, which is cool. Rick also said thanks for keeping at it and appreciates our commitment to go through each album in such detail. So thanks for the kind words and for sharing your thoughts on the Xenon Codex album, which can be found on the YouTube comments. Rick actually wrote a lot and it was cool to read. Anne Taylor on email said that she did some graphical work on the Chaos illuminations used throughout the noughties and beyond, so that's something to look forward to in season 4. Peter Snelling on YouTube said, Hawkwind have been the soundtrack of my life, but this podcast is opening my mind to albums that I gave up on long ago. He mentioned that our coverage of Choose Your Masques specifically made him dust off his copy and re-listen with renewed appreciation, which is again an amazing result for us. So thanks, Peter. Glad you found new ways to listen to that and enjoy it. That's kind of what we're here for. Branwell Johnson sent us an email to congratulate us for getting the Xenon Codex out. He was waiting for a flight at Madrid airport and said the wait was so long he was able to listen to the whole podcast and the album together to get the full experience, which is, if copyright law didn't exist, the way we'd love to actually make the podcast. So that's very, very cool. Roger Neville Neal, yes, that one, reached out on email to say hi after we talked about his work on the Xenon Codex. His email was interesting, but hi is definitely the one thing I can say he definitely said. Apparently, Ian Abrams and Pasco Brock both told him to check out the podcast, which is cool. That's a little bit of A-listing going on there for our listeners, making it the most star-studded email we've ever received, I think it's safe to say. I think the most interesting thing he said was that listening to the podcast was like undergoing some strange psychiatric session, which I'll definitely take as a compliment. Sam Shepherd on email let us know that he's listening, so welcome aboard, Sam. He also requested that we do a proper review of Captain Lockheed and the Starfighters album, which is definitely on our to-do list if I can find strong enough medication to withstand listening to that album on repeat long enough to do a full review, but we shall definitely see. Bart Simpson, not spelt like Bart Simpson, on YouTube, on the OG episode, said that there was a 1930s record called Hurry Sundown that had very similar lyrics. I looked and I couldn't find it, but if there was more of a busky folk song vibe going on, then I guess it makes sense that those kind of songs existed beyond the band. It would be interesting to know if anyone knows where that track came from or knows this song, but like I said, I couldn't find it, but maybe that's something for our hardcore listeners to get involved, seeing if they can source that. John Crockford emailed us to say that he was disappointed that he didn't run into us at the Prognosis gig. That was probably my fault due to my flight being delayed 3 hours. So unfortunately, we didn't get to tailgate it like we planned. Next time, John, for sure. He also mentioned that Rama the Prophecy is a reimagining of an old track that appears on Onward from 2012. So we'll have to check that out also in season 4 and totally break the timeline when we do that full review. Last couple here, Steve Bailey on YouTube mentioned that Tim dropped a little bit of Mars, the Bringer of War from Holst into Right to Decide during that gig. I didn't notice that because Right to Decide is new to me in general, but that was a very good spot. Very cool. Nick Randalls emailed to say thank you for reminding him what a good album the Xenon Codex is. Mission accomplished there. He also said that he was blown away by the future never waits, and the current iteration of Hawkwind shows that Dave has surrounded himself by a brilliant lineup, and they're pushing the boundaries of what makes a wonderful Hawkwind record, which we are in agreement with. Darren Evanson on YouTube had similar things that our coverage of Xenon Codex got him to re-listen and re-appreciate it more than before. He said that Hugh's solo on Lost Chronicles is just perfect, and you'll find no argument from us there. Ray Linley on YouTube said that he caught the Manchester gig of Hawkwind's latest tour and that they were really great, so that's very cool. Paul Collins on YouTube said Rama is full-on space rock with good soloing, and he can hear gong influences throughout the album, which again I think we also agree with. Toby Whiting on email said that he discovered us at the Quark episode and went back and marathoned everything we've done, so props for that. He also mentioned that there's a version of Lost Chronicles without the Neon Skyline revisit on the Atom Henge compilation, so I'll be checking that out. JM Somebody's Brother on YouTube said that he saw the current Hawkwind lineup at the Northern Kin Festival and they were also great, so Hawkwind clearly on a very consistent form right now. Neil Shea on YouTube said greetings from down under. He said that he listens to the podcast while fighting bushfires, which is possibly the most badass way of listening to the podcast that I know about. He also said that he appreciates all the little vignettes and details we add to the podcast and hear how much work goes into each episode. And so thanks a lot for your listening, and we hope you still have your cabinet key. Steve Litchfield on email popped in to say hello. He actually maintains a few Hawkwind websites, so the fact that he said he's enjoying the podcast makes me feel very happy that we're adding to the fandom in a beneficial way. And yes, please do get in contact again when you've waded through all the episodes. We'd love to hear from you. And finally, thank you to everyone who posted on Brian Pitkin's Hawkwind and Related Album History Facebook group that it was my birthday. And so thanks to everyone who said that a long time ago now.
Wow, that is a lot of comms, so well done there. And lots of people mentioning the things they liked about various 1980s albums, which is great because that is why we are here. We are looking back at Hawkwind in the 1980s. Now, to get us off and running again, after such a long gap since we last recorded, we thought we would not just treat you with the voices of Matt and myself. We have a writer, musician, photographer, academic, the one and only professor of creative writing at Leeds Trinity University with us on this podcast, Oz Hardwick. How are you doing?
Hello there, I'm doing very well, thank you. While you've been saying that, I did just look up Hurry Sundown by Richard Huey and his Sundown Singers. There you go.
That's some real-time myth-busting.
Yeah.
Check out YouTube now, yeah. Hurry Sundown, bracket, See What Tomorrow Brings. Very different sounding record, but there you go.
I'd be interested to check that out. And what a way to start. So you're obviously a very busy man with all of those different things that you do.
Yeah, I'm not good at sleeping.
I can imagine. And we're going to get into all of these because it's pretty fascinating. We could pretty much do a Ozbinge podcast, I suspect, on all of this. Because, in fact, all of these classifications don't really do you justice because you do all of these different things in a number of different mediums and forms. But starting with the writing, particularly given your position as Professor of Creative Writing at Leeds Trinity, is that the first of these kind of art forms that you began with?
Yes, it is. But as you say, they all sort of bump into each other and start arguments and fall over each other and things. It's just that comes from that sort of childhood fascination with just the sound of words and nonsense rhymes and things. And I was, already it gets into music as a kid because I was a small child at the end of the 60s where you've got things like I'm the Walrus on the radio and just these bizarre lyrics. It's a strange time in popular culture lyrically that suddenly the doors are open. It's no longer boy meets girl, it's boy meets walrus or whatever. So it's a really good time for British psychedelia, particularly that sort of Lewis Carroll inflected bizarreness. And so my music and literature things just sort of grew up together in a way, I guess.
Is that kind of wordplay what resulted in you really going deep into the prose poetry side of things?
Yes, I think so, yeah. Prose poetry, the brief but contestable definition for anyone that doesn't know what it is, it's essentially poetry without line breaks. It looks like a very short story or flash fiction on the page, but it actually uses the sort of impetus of poetic thought to create it rather than overriding narrative concern. So in some ways, although it's delivered as verse, for locking in with the sort of Hawkwind things, it's like the sort of things that Mike Moorcock contributed to Hawkwind, I think. Less so Bob, who of course was a great poet, but I think Mike's stuff was closer to prose poetry in a way, which is why I guess some of them are more or less straight from his novels. Black Corridor, for example, and some of the dragony bits and what have you.
And was that scene, that kind of underground scene, and there was Friends magazine, wasn't there, and all of that from the 60s, was that something that you, obviously not at the time, I'm guessing that was probably slightly too early, but was that something that you dived into?
I just caught the very back end of it, in that we had what came to be known as a head shop, although I'd never heard of the term at the time. Maybe it was called that. I was too young to know. In Plymouth, where I was growing up, and you'd sort of go in there when your parents didn't know and have a look through the magazines and so on. So I was always attracted to the look of the underground magazines and so on as well, the artwork and everything. It was a real enthusiasm. And there was a lot of, in kids' TV at the time, there was quite a surreal emphasis in them. Things like Do Not Adjust Your Set, and The Scaffold used to do a programme. So you got Roger McGough, who's, one of the most popular poets in the past 50 years in Britain, doing knockabout children's TV. So I wasn't precocious intellect or anything getting into poetry. It's just I picked on a certain part of the entertainment when I was a kid that just fascinated me.
And I guess it was part of youth culture, wasn't it? I'm just reminded instantly of the beat poet thing that happened. Was it Royal Albert Hall and all that? And that was packed and the beat poets turned up. So poetry and that kind of wordsmithing was part of youth culture, wasn't it? Very much so at the time.
Yeah, and performance and so on. Before we started up, we talked briefly about Arthur Brown, and I remember I was 8 when he came on Top of the Pops with his head on fire and this terrifying makeup, and I was equal parts fascinated and terrified. But this was, Top of the Pops on a Thursday evening. You're getting this crazy man with his strange makeup, head on fire, and these band with sort of monkish cowls on and so on. Popular culture, really, it was a lot more open than it is now, I think, a lot less formulaic, and they sort of throw anything on and see what sold, and it was good for musicians and artists and so on, and it was a good time to be a kid growing up with this.
Amazing. Now, you've been writing poetry pretty consistently. Even your last book, The Census of Preconceptions, was out last year, I believe, and is available. So you've been keeping writing at a reasonably steady pace?
Yes, I started writing as these odd little children, like the Bronte sisters or something, write my tiny little books when I was a kid. But from just before my teens, I guess, I wrote quite a lot, but just kept it to myself, really, and then started sending things out in my 20s and getting a few things published, and then I got distracted for a bit. But the past sort of 25 years, I've been doing it in a very disciplined chaos of writing every day and so on.
Excellent. And so for anybody out there, The Census of Preconceptions on Survision Books is out there. But if somebody was looking to start with Oz Hardwick poetry, would that be the place to start? Or is there a book that you would point people at and go work from there?
There was a chapbook came out in 2018 called Learning to Have Lost. That won a sort of a small international award. So that's my greatest hit. So maybe that's the one to go for. I like the new one a lot, which from someone who doesn't know me sounds phenomenally arrogant. But like most people who write or do music or whatever, some you like, some you don't. Once you've done them and they're out there, you start seeing the flaws in them and so on. But I'm kind of happy with that one. The current one's not a bad place to go from.
That's great. We will put links out to both of those following the release of this pod. Writing, and particularly writing poetry, would lend itself very well to lyric writing. So it's no surprise to see you being involved in music and bands from both a writing and, I believe, performance point of view, right? And a lot of that I looked at until very recently was based in various different types of folk. But that's changed in the relatively recent past with a new band that you've been involved with and a very recent release. Talk to us about that.
Well, the folk thing, again, comes out of childhood. another 60s thing. It was still the age of folk music in schools and so on. And my grandfather lived with us, who was a shepherd in the early 20th century in the Lake District, and had his little songs and played his melodeon and so on. And also in Plymouth, it was a good place for folk clubs once I got old enough. So the folk music was there. And my grandfather also loved poetry, which I think is perhaps some of where that came from. But yeah, so I've done a few sort of folky things. A friend and I were in a duo called Sixpenny Wake for a while, and we had a couple of tracks on compilation albums. I did something with a guy called Peter Byram Smith, who's a classical composer, and we did a 20-minute sequence that came out as a CD as well. But ever since my teens, I wanted to be in a space rock band because I'm not a very good musician. And so I thought, seeing Bob there particularly, he didn't have to play anything. He'd just stand there and read his words out. And I thought that'd be brilliant. So I've actually managed to do a bit of that of late that's got released. The album that I presume you're referring to is Space Druids.
That's the one.
Paradox Paradigm, which Dean Starling, who's the man who wrote everything and plays a fair bit of the album, although there are other musicians on it. There's another drummer and a few guests who I might say something about, was looking for. He's not a native English speaker. I wanted someone to write some lyrics. And so various people sent things in, and he liked the one I did and said, actually, would you write the lot? So I ended up writing the album, and then there were a couple of spoken pieces, and it seemed logical that I did them. And then there's bits of my voice in there as well. Fortunately, for anyone who knows me, I don't attempt to sing at any point. Instead, the singing's done by Danny Faulkner, who you may know from Pre-Med.
Nice.
So again, little Hawkwind connection there with Danny and Alan and so on.
So you're kind of the Michael Moorcock.
Yes, possibly. But even more recently, this week came out, and I don't know if you've come across Incubus Love Child yet, who have been doing a few of the little space rock festivals and so on. A guy called Mark Skidder Edwards, it's his band.
I have not.
There's a new album coming out later in the year called Dead World, and the Dead World preview EP has just come out, which I'm on. Niall Hone, of course, who you will know.
Indeed, yep.
Plays bass on it. So I've got a track on there, which is taken from my book of a few years ago called Wolf Planet, which is a sort of a speculative science fiction-y fairy tale-y thing. So he just invited me to use that. But that's just come out, and the album will be out November, December.
So look out for Dead World by Incubus Love Child. And right now you can hear Paradox Paradigm by Space Druids. That's on all of your favourite streaming platforms, and I assume in some physical forms as well, hopefully.
It is physically present in the world, yeah.
Excellent, as it should be. So that's super exciting as well. And obviously Paradox Paradigm came out last year, which was also the year that your latest book came out. So last year was pretty busy. But at the same time, there was also an exhibition of your photography. So we have to get to the photography. And I believe you were actually trained as a photographer.
Yeah, when I left school, I went to Plymouth Art College and trained as a photographer there. And my particular enthusiasm was performance photography, mainly theatre at that time. I did pretty well there, but when I left, I just didn't have the personality for a photographer. You've got to be quite in people's faces, I think, really. To a certain extent, that sort of selling yourself, even if you're doing a sort of photography that you're over there not getting noticed, you have to sell yourself. I can't do that at all, so I didn't actually get a job doing that. But I just kept it up and somehow managed to get myself involved with Hawkwind, who were absolutely lovely people. And for some reason, this sort of dorky, awkward young bloke with a camera, they let in and were very nice to.
And when would this be?
This was early 80s. I'm guessing about 82, 83, sort of Choose Your Masques era.
And were you already like a Hawkwind fan at that point, or did that come later?
Oh, yeah, I was the age to see Silver Machine on Top of the Pops and just go, what the hell was that? I love that. I want to be there. And that was it. Instant. So 51 years ago now. So when I started getting a camera into places where you could get a camera in, and then I think I just wrote through Brian Torn's Hawk fan and said, can I possibly get a photo pass or something? And they were all absolutely brilliant to me and very nice.
So Never Meet Your Heroes was definitely not true of Hawkwind, which is great to hear. It's always so dispiriting. I've had it with other bands where you've read interviews and gone, I'll just listen to the music. But it's great to hear that you got in with the band that you loved and you were enjoying and then found that they were excellent human beings as well. That's rewarding.
I always found them as such, whatever else they're like, off in their lives. None of them would be best mates or anything, but they're people that I have a lot of respect for, and they're very nice.
Outstanding. And you've obviously taken a lot of photos of Hawkwind, because that 2022 exhibition that I mentioned was of your Hawkwind photography.
It was, yeah. It was one of those things that was initially planned for the 50th anniversary of the first album. But of course, the universe had other plans in 2020.
Yes.
And so it did take a couple of years for it to happen. And it finally happened last year. And it was good. It was nice. Got a lot of positive responses. And it was about the same time as Martin Popoff's Hawkwind Visual History book came out, to which I'm a major contributor.
Yes.
Which was sort of nice as well. And I know that sort of book isn't everyone's idea of a good investment or whatever, just a bunch of pictures in a book, but it's a lot of my life in there. So I love it. And, you know, the people who like that sort of thing, it's a nice book.
It must be a bit of a trip down memory lane for you, seeing photos that you took so many years ago. It must rekindle some thoughts.
Yeah, I'd had photos on a number of reissues. Obviously, the one I'm most pleased with is the Flick Knife Years box set front cover, because, you know, when I was 20, the idea of a picture of mine on the front of a Hawkwind album, you've got to be joking. And there it was. And I found that with a few bands, actually, that people that I knew in the 80s suddenly is, you know, the expanded version and what have you comes out, and they want contemporary memorabilia and pictures. So there's a few bands that I've been able to do that with. But when Martin got in touch after that, it was, okay, I'll dig into the boxes of things and what have I got? I'd taken a lot, and it was nice to see them. It really was. And just to scan them and send them off and thinking about, oh, that was whenever, and I remember that, and so on. And it was nice to go back to the, I mean, you said that, you know, the Thatcher years that no one's going to say. Already it's become a thing because I've repeated it. But, you know, the 80s wasn't a good time. And yet to go back to the little bits of brightness in there has been very good.
That's fantastic. And what an excellent segue, because Hawkwind in the 80s is what we're here to discuss. But all of that means that if you want to read Oz Hardwick, then the latest is Census of Preconceptions. If you want to hear Oz Hardwick, then the latest is Paradox Paradigm by Space Druids. And if you want to see Oz Hardwick's work, then Martin Popoff's Hawkwind, a visual biography, contains a lifetime of Oz's photos of Hawkwind live, which is a pretty good way to immerse yourself in the various talents of Oz.
We need a fragrance from you, Oz, so we can smell Oz Hardwick.
Exactly.
Yeah, it smells of old school developer fluid and patchouli oil.
I would wear that.
So the 80s and Hawkwind. The 80s was when I properly got into Hawkwind, but I didn't see them until much later. 87, I think, was my first. So I didn't really journey in real time with the band through the 80s. Matt has experienced it in kind of a linear fashion by going album by album by album by album, which is completely different to the way I did it. And you've done it differently again because you were there in it with the sights and the smells of a rock band on tour. So it's interesting to think about, obviously you loved Hawkwind in the 70s, so you were aware of them and you'd heard those big albums, Quark and Hall of the Mountain Grill and all the others. And then there's the 1980s, which is where we found in all the correspondence that we've had, people really love it. Other people switch off completely. Albums suddenly have, this is a brilliant album, this is really awful. It's much more divided when you get to the 80s. And so I'm interested to see where you come down. And then Matt, who's waited very patiently while I've been talking a lot, just to see, because Matt and I haven't really had this discussion yet either. So how do you look back at Hawkwind in the 1980s?
I think it's the most diverse decade of the many years in terms of how phenomenally different they are at different periods during that. I mean, you can see the 70s as, you know, a progression that you've got the sort of before Bob rejoined and after, and there's a sort of a logic to it. But you start off the 80s with this quite sharp newly polished band, and then you go through the chaotic Nick Turner years, becoming increasingly chaotic. And then I think by the end of the 80s, we've got a slightly uncertain band that are still doing interesting music, but it's not quite settled into where it's going next. Must be the era of the most lineup changes as well, which is part of that. And I like most of it. And throughout all of that, interesting to hear the praise for Zen and Codex earlier on, because I think that's a bit of a weird one towards the end of the decade. But it's a period for which I have great affection for the music, and also there's something else as well. Of course, it's still the mythologized 70s version you get of Hawkwind. You know, you've had Joe on, and his book is just magnificent on the connections and so on through there. You know, Hawkwind are an important band in the 80s as well. I think counterculturally and in terms of their musical influences on others and so on, and that engagement with the rise and calamitous fall of free festival culture and so on. And, you know, they're right at the heart of that. So I think it's a really interesting era in terms of their place in music culture and their engagement with what's going on elsewhere also. So I think it's a fascinating period with some really good music. And I still think somewhere in the vaults there must be a couple of pretty damn awesome live albums that ought to come out. Just after Nick leaves, I'd love a really good live album from that slightly stripped down, regaining a focus era. That'd be brilliant for me. But anyway, yeah, so I think the overview is that it's chaotic, diverse, really interesting, and a lot of really good music coming out of it.
And Matt, unlike the 70s, the 80s is a time where you've actually got some references to go back to. There's an element of familiarity with some of the sounds that we're hearing. After having had a few months since we finished Xenon Codex, how do you reflect on season 2?
I think I reflect on it pretty favorably. You know, I was just going back through the master playlist because I was starting to put together the best of the 80s as far as we were concerned in our chats. And this one, it was funny because even a few of them when I was listening, I was like, oh, I'm surprised that's what we picked. But yeah, I think that the 80s itself, it was a journey, you know, and I think the Hawkwind in the 70s sounded like, I guess, you know, them, because that's when they started. But, you know, they were bringing in electronics, so they were always not quite what you would expect from a traditional 70s band. They were trying to add swazzle, they were trying to do audio visuals. They were overachievers in a way. Despite being very haphazard at playing, they knew that they had this dimension and this whole experience they wanted to bring. And then that transforms in the 80s because you then have people who know what they're doing. So you lose some of that startup charm. For a while, you get some of the best musicians, arguably, who played in the 80s to join them. And then you realize that there is something musical in there because it's not when you get good people, it actually falls apart because people are like, oh, this is actually crap. They're like, oh, no, we can actually do things. And there's the imagination that comes through. The 80s sound is the thing that Hawkwind fight a bit of a losing battle with it, but eventually at the very end of the 80s find a way to make it their own, actually, and it doesn't feel like they've been fully 80sified. They feel like they've come to some kind of ceasefire with it. If you look at tracks like Arrival in Utopia and even The Sword of the East, you know, I feel like that's got the production, but it has the thought still. And I think going into season 3, when we have lost most of the established thought leaders for what Hawkwind have been famous for, that is very interesting to me, even though, you know, we've jumped in time and we've just had The Future Never Wastes and the Leave Your Body by the Incinerator, you know, which has clearly come from this iteration of the band. It's still there, so I'm excited to see what we do between that and now being the end of the 80s for us, obviously. But yeah, I think it's been overall a fairly strong decade for them. And again, being new and not being as invested as some people clearly are, I don't feel anywhere near as dismissive of the 80s as some people have been. That may well be from someone who's listening in 2023. But I was worried when I was reading some of the stuff people were saying, like, oh no, get ready for a decade of strife. You're like, I don't know. And I'm glad that some people have even emailed us saying, do you know what, I listened to it again and it's not as bad as I thought. Because even as Ian said, sometimes you listen to things through the filter of either groupthink or your own mood or whatever, and it becomes, you know, more about like what you feel. And I think listening to it objectively, it's a good stuff, and it has been some stuff which I've gone back and listened to even after we've stopped recording, which, given the amount of times I listen to it when we are recording, is definitely a ring of endorsement.
That's interesting, because obviously that is what Hawkbinge is. This music without any baggage, without any reverence or reflection on a new audience, and what is it like as it actually is fresh now for you. So that's really interesting to hear that. I found definitely that through some of the early 80s, like the RCA trio of albums, are albums that I've always gone back to quite often, particularly Choose Your Masques. But they were ones that I got reasonably early when I was just going into secondhand record shops and buying whatever had Hawkwind on it, not knowing what era it came from, what lineup the band was. You know, there was no Wikipedia where you could just read, okay, and then follow that one with that one and that one with that one. You just kind of pick them up higgledy-piggledy. And I always loved those records. But I did find on reflection that it seems to me the perception of Hawkwind in the 1980s is somewhat dominated by Chronicle of the Black Sword. A lot of the correspondence we got was this was the first gig, this was the first album, and certainly the correspondence we had about Xenon Codex was I'd never really heard this one properly because it was in so much in the shadow of Black Sword. And Black Sword is a little bit Marmite-y. I've always liked it. I was so into it at the time. Funnily enough, I prefer Xenon Codex to Black Sword now, but for the last 30 odd years, I would have said completely the opposite, but coming back to it fresh for the podcast. Where are you with Black Sword, Oz? You must have been there and seen those amazing early performances of it.
Yeah, I went down to Guildford for the opening night of the tour. Had to change the tyre on my dodgy Mini on the way down, and I went to many of those, and then Bristol, I think, was the last one. I have clear memories of that as well. And a bit of a blur in the middle, but yes, I don't listen to it much now. I listen to the live album a lot. Not because I don't like the studio album, but because I just think that the live one brought so much more, because it's got some of Hugh Lloyd Langton's best work on the live one that aren't on the studio, you know, all those classic Huey numbers. And you go, oh, Black Sword. Oh, no, they weren't on there. They just came into the live set. That's the album, along with Levitation, that he most shone on. You know, that period, he came to the fore, whether it's that lovely use of the EBO on a lot of that, but also things like Dreaming City and Moonglum and so on, just fan favourites, quite rightly. I mean, it was a funny tour because there's that famous, absolutely comedic picture that goes around of them all in their around the shield, looking a bit awkward. And there was a certain amount of that in the presentation. But once you got there and got into it, you're getting involved in a theatrical performance. And it's one of those things that the band does every so often that is a thing in itself. It's not just a bunch of songs struck together with great visuals or anything. It's actually a thought-out performance. And it was great. Obviously, it brought in some of the old stuff as well. It was the first time we'd heard Magnu and Assault and Battery for years as well, which are absolute classics that had been out of the set for a while. And there's some strong new material in there. I know you've already mentioned Marmiteness of a number of 80s things, and I know one that people have is Needle Gun, particularly. I think Richard Chadwick's said how he loathes this song. I like the rhythm, but what on earth were they thinking with those lyrics? But as an album, it's a very strong rock album with Hawkwindy touches, and then it became Hawkwind Live, I think, with everything else in it.
That's really interesting that you say that, because we did the special on the live album because it's such a big live album. For me, there's kind of three huge Hawkwind live albums. Space Ritual, obviously. Live 79 seems like an important moment. And then Live Chronicles. And a lot of the correspondence we had was that a lot of people get their Black Sword fix by listening to Live Chronicles rather than Black Sword. The sound of it seems better. As you say, they're filling it out with a lot of other songs. I think we picked as one of our favourite tracks from a Live Chronicles was the Live Chronicles version of Master of the Universe, which I love that version of Master of the Universe. It's almost a completely different song from the original, because I love the original as well. But it's interesting that you're obviously also one of those people that if you had memories of Black Sword and wanted to immerse in it, I'm guessing you would go to the live album.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's something about the 80s ones. I think there's something quite 80s studio-ish about them, which you've sort of referred to earlier. And I think Choose Your Masques, mentioned it, and it's an album that, is it that one that says this is a headphone album or something, or is that Levitation?
That's Levitation, yeah.
Levitation, yeah. But I think it's another one. I do remember getting it home from record shop in Bedford or something. That I bought it and I've stuck it on there on the day of release. And, it's very studio-y and it's got that 80s thing, which for me doesn't age very well, that sort of clashy sort of percussion sound. But the Coded Languages sort of live set from Hammersmith that came out on Cherry Red a few years ago, brilliant. It gives them a bit more life, a bit more breath, and it's a wonderful record, that. I really like the track Choose Your Masques when it hasn't got the sort of mechanicalness of it. And of course, that was on Black Sword as well. So there's something about the way that those albums, they've not had what the 70s ones had of having the tracks played live a lot beforehand. You start off with Live 79, which I think we can talk about because it was released in 1980. So it's the first album of 1980, but there are opening sets with two stonking brilliant numbers that no one had heard before in Shot Down the Night and Motorway City. And they'd been really bashed in on the road. So by the time you're getting Motorway City appearing in a studio version, they really had worked at this one. Whereas there were a lot of things on the 80s albums that hadn't been taken on the road first, and they grew in the playing live.
Another album which occupies, for want of a more defined phrase, a slightly weird spot in the catalogue is Church of Hawkwind, which I was interested to see what Matt would think of, because obviously I'm more aware of what Hawkwind fans tend to think of Church of Hawkwind. And Matt, you were broadly in line with it as being a strange one.
Yeah, for sure. I remember having a lot of trouble with it until I reconfigured my brain and how I listened to it. The other albums up until then, especially, when you open the decade with Levitation, they're very detailed listening albums and they reward that. And when this feels much more light in production, maybe even light in sometimes instrument quality, then I started listening to it while doing other things. So I wasn't listening to it as detailedly, and I enjoyed it a lot more. And I compared it more to kind of a mixtape, the kind of thing that DJs and rappers and stuff like throw together now. They're like little collections of thoughts, and a track could be 2 seconds or a track could be 17 minutes. It doesn't matter. It's all just like, this is where I am right now sonically, and you can check it out. And as soon as I felt like this was Hawkwind's mixtape, I enjoyed it a lot more, and there's definitely some highlights. But I think on the whole, it's a low light in the whole thing, but with a couple of real standouts. Like Some People Never Die, I think I said in the review that it's more art than music, and I think that was the first time I could ever really say that about some of Hawkwind's stuff. They've done some great pieces, they've done music artfully, but they hadn't transcended into a audio art space. And I think because that felt like it was performed rather than played, I could almost feel like I was in White Cube and someone with a mixer was just like blending random art pieces together, and I thought that was really, really cool. So if I had to wade through that whole album to get to that, it was worth it. But it was more experimental than I was ready for. But certainly I like it more than I did. That could be probably the strap line of the entire podcast, couldn't it?
It does feel a bit, Oz, like it's the strange one in the middle of the two more coherent albums in Sonic Attack and Choose Your Masques. Or was it one that you actually got pretty much straight away?
Well, Matt just mentioned Some People Never Die, which of course had come out in one form or another on the Weird tape a few years before, and it had come through very much as a sort of Dave demo. And so I think I sort of listened to this album first as if it was a Dave solo album, although it says Hawkwind on the front, and it is very much, isn't it? It's that sort of elaborated, and I think that idea of sketches and so on is very much the case. And so it's not one that you're going to rock out to. It's very much a different sort of listening experience, and I appreciated it for what it was. And sorry to bang on about the negatives here, and when Flesh Fondue came out a few years ago, I saw this was coming up and I thought, oh god, no. But I think it works well in that setting.
Flesh Fondue
for his unearthly human crew.
Yeah, but it works in its resetting as a sort of a grungy, noisy thing. And of course, the groove from the Church of track. Jane Weaver samples it and produces a brilliant song out of that. So the low spot for me on this album has gone on to be 2 tracks that I really like. But it's one of those things that if you got the album on, you hope no one that doesn't like Hawkwind comes in, because it just fuels everything. I really think it's a terrible lyric. And yet, when it's delivered with the sort of over-the-top snarling over a grunginess, it works. But there's a lot I like. I like Fall of Earth City and Last Messiah and so on. Just these textures and the floatiness. I like a lot of sort of early 70s German stuff as well, which Hawkwind has always had an affinity with. And I think this is sort of edging towards what would give birth to the ambient stuff later on.
There were definitely a couple of bits in there I felt, and I can't remember if you agreed, Matt, but there seemed to me that on Choose Your Masques, there were elements of Choose Your Masques that felt like they were the result of the experimentation that happened on Church of Hawkwind, particularly some of the more electronic bits, which is less of on Sonic Attack. Sonic Attack is quite a heavy rock album, and Choose Your Masques reintroduces some more spacey electronic stuff, which felt to me like the continuation or a refinement of things that Dave was experimenting with in Church of Hawkwind. Does that sound about right to you, Oz?
Yeah, and I think, Church of Hawkwind, it's difficult to know how long these things have been lying about. I think this is probably the result of a few years there, and we need someone like Keith Knighton or someone who knows the Dave Brock archive well or something to fill that in. And I think it is that sort of, here's the experiments that were stripped away, and I think that's quite true of Sonic Attack. Sonic Attack, by the way, is the one that I took longest to get into of all the 80s albums. When it came out, I thought I was very disappointed indeed, for various reasons, which we'll probably go into later on. But yeah, it's the bits that have been removed from Sonic Attack in a way, perhaps, that sort of the more experimental electronic things.
Well, let's do Sonic Attack, and let's go to Matt first and then come back to you on this one. Matt, you've always obviously had to contend with the fact that you can't end one Hawkwind album with any expectations of what the next one's going to deliver because they're so completely different. But obviously, we were coming off the back of Levitation to get to Sonic Attack, and that must have been, I can imagine, quite the jolt.
Yeah, Sonic Attack was still, I think, one of the most difficult ones for me. I mean, the Sonic Attack poem is still not my favorite thing. I think it's okay. We always talk about the whole making love opener. I always find this gets it onto a bad note, but if you can get past that, it gets better and kind of more interesting. That said, I played a cover of it at a bar in New York as a tribute to the anniversary, so I can't hate it that much. But it's still but it's a strange one, the opener. I think they've done it in more interesting ways than the Sonic Attack that is actually on this one. And then Rocky Paths is kind of whatever, isn't it? Psychosonia. Version of the World was a good track as far as I remember.
You did compare Angels of Death to Sultans of Swing.
Sultans of Death, yes.
Sultans of Death, yes.
Yeah, I called it Slightly Dire Straits somehow, I did, yeah. And I think but the reason I did that was just because I felt like they were playing in a style which was not what I was expecting. This is probably the first example of the 80s are coming to get them. It felt like they were playing in a way which the years demanded rather than where the 70s where people didn't seem to care so much. They were doing 70s in their own way, and the fact that Sonic Attack comes out and it feels quite 80s, I was like, oh no, whether it's production, whether or not it's label pressure, whether or not it's a need to eat, I don't know what it is, but they're sounding like everything else, and that's a shame. That shouldn't be happening. Then you find later on, they get back into their groove and it's a lot better. But I did think that Sonic Attack as an album still for me feels like Hawkwind fighting a losing battle with the 80s rather than later albums, which makes me feel like Hawkwind have learned to coexist peacefully. But yeah, I thought Angels of Death was all right. Again, I think there was a nicer version of it on
Live Chronicles.
So I got that back again, I got some of these back beefed up, so it still works out. There is some exuberance for sure. I mean, Living on a Knife Edge I remember really liking. I love that, living on a knife edge looking for the ground. I always thought that was a really nice line. But yeah, I feel like as an album, even the look of it, I think we talked about it looks more metally than they actually are. and it sounds more 80s than they are. So yeah, this just feels like Hawkwind wearing an ill-fitting suit that fortunately they're able to throw off quite quickly. So yeah, it was an interesting one to talk about, but definitely not one that makes it back onto my record player any time, I don't think.
Got you. So Oz, that's someone who came to it completely cold and had a first listen and then obviously listened to it many, many times before we recorded the podcast. From your kind of real time back in the day, you said that you weren't particularly happy when this one came out.
I think very much for the same reason. I think Sonic Attack is a very weak version. I think there are a few probably of their time problems, and you said, Matt, about that opening, and it's very much in the early 70s. It was a bit, ooh, whereas by the early 80s, it's just what? But also, I don't think the delivery's good, and it's trying to turn something which is quite menacing in its sound. Whatever you think of the words, the sound on Space Ritual is menacing, whereas it's trying to turn it into a rock song, and it's not. And it doesn't work for me, and so that put me off. There's a couple of things. I love Disintegration to go on for a really long time. I love the sound of that, but it is that Kerrang-friendly sound to it. Here's a rock song now, and there isn't the continuity that there's been on other albums. It seems like a collection of rock songs, and they can do more interesting than that, and they do later on than they did before. I suppose this is the one that I had to rethink, and I remember getting it and thinking, and just sort of sticking it away somewhere for a very long time. And going back to it now, I like coded languages, but I don't think this is the best version of it. Again, the live version opens up a bit more energy, a bit looser, because I think Hawkwind are best when they're a little bit loose around the edges. That's one of the things they do very well. Whereas this is a bit sort of regimented. Even the electronics seem quite rigid. We've just sort of lost Tim Blake, who I was delighted when he came back in at the end of the 70s, who just has that, influence of sort of 18th century romanticism in there somehow in the electronic instruments. And it's got that big, spacious quality. Whereas this is quite constrained, I think, and it's not what they do so well. So it's the sound of it as much as the material, and some good stuff. I'm like Angels of Death, as has been said later on, live version great, first heard on the recordings of Bristol from 77 Sonic Assassins recording, that it sort of drifts into something that would become a proper track later on. It's a little bit watered down and too constrained, I think, and when they come out live and are really whacking into it, it's quite powerful, but I don't feel it is on the album.
So I'm the odd one out here in that when I bought Sonic Attack, I got Sonic Attack before I had Space Ritual. So the Sonic Attack version of Sonic Attack was the first Sonic Attack I heard. So I didn't know what it was supposed to be. And therefore I loved it. And weirdly, I still really like it now, but that's probably because it's almost like, well, which is your James Bond or which is your Doctor Who? It's the first one. So I very much do love the Space Ritual version. And if somebody said to me, which is the best version, I would say that one, despite the fact that weirdly I'm attracted to the one on Sonic Attack, because I got so used to hearing it being that before I had to get used to the fact that it used to be something else. And I used to play this a lot, and I think this is one of those albums where it had an instant kind of a hit for me when I heard it, which would have been around 84, 85, when I was going through the secondhand buckets and picking up Hawkwind albums. So it would have been around there that I heard it, which was probably my Kerrang era. But I think some of those albums where you get an instant kind of hit from, when you've had that instant hit and you put it down, it's kind of worn a little thin and you don't go back to it. And sometimes the album that you get that your first thought is, oh, I'm not sure about this, become your favorite albums, don't they, later on down the line. So I think this is one of those that was in the former, where I really liked it when I first heard it. It was the stuff I was really into. But as I got more into the more experimental and weirder sides of things, that album lost its sheen for me a bit. And certainly of those RCA, the three, Choose Your Masques is absolutely the standout of that era. And I think, Matt, you were very taken with Choose Your Masques. I remember that was quite a triumphant episode of the podcast.
Yeah, I mean, coming out of church, it was certainly, something that was immediately more familiar. So it was nice to say that, oh yeah, I can, ease back into my Hawkwind listening experience with this one. I think this is probably one of the most cohesive electronic albums that they put out, because Levitation sounds great, but the keyboards and electric stuff are almost expected within it. It's a bit more like by the books. Then Sonic Attack doesn't really have that much. Church of Hawkwinds is people messing around with drum machines and keyboards, but it's actually Choose Your Masques where all of this comes together and actually feels like it all works nicely. So yeah, there's a lot of texture, which is really, really good. There's also a nice mix of tracks which feel like tracks and tracks which feel like ideas. The fact you can go from Choose Your Masques straight into Dream Worker, for example, is really interesting. Arrival in Utopia, one of my favorite tracks, great idea, sounds great, sung really, really nicely. And then, it has the controversial Silver Machine on it, which I don't mind, but I know some people find that absolute sacrilege. Again, because maybe I wasn't listening to this when Silver Machine was the biggest track ever. For me, Silver Machine is kind of another track for them. I can see why it was big, but I didn't get the feeling like it was the track and it was the single. So I don't mind them trying to make an 80s version of it. I think the 70s version is arguably better. I think they did a good job. I didn't think it was a travesty. Waiting for Tomorrow is also a fantastic track with a great rhythm section. I remember just beating out that Waiting for Tomorrow. I just feel like that live would have been quite a spectacular thing to listen to. So yeah, I would say that Choose Your Masques is pretty good. I'm not a big fan of how it looks, and it looks a little fantasy-y. It's drawn a little fantasy-y, the kind of style which repels me almost viscerally, just because I'm, it's not my thing. But no, just like sonically, I think there's a lot to like in that album. I think it was really good.
The strong tracks for me on Choose Your Masques had traditionally been side one. I'd loved all of side one. I thought it was almost perfect side one. And then side two, I was less familiar with. They'd stuck in my mind less. And coming back to it, the Hugh tracks on side two, Hugh's kind of on fire on this with like Waiting for Tomorrow, Solitary Mind Games are beautiful. And we talked about Hugh. And this is an era where, as you spoke about earlier, Oz, the live band at this time are really on fire.
Yeah, it's somebody that splits opinion, Nick Turner. He just came back on the tour for this, and whatever happened later on, at that time, it really worked. You listen to Nick's flute in there, and I love Nick's flute playing more than the sax. I just think I could, and have done, listen to his flute playing for a long time. And I think particularly on things like Solitary Mind Games, where it just sort of dances around the guitar, it's beautiful. And it was a real sense of purpose, I think. And the stage shows for Choose Your Masques were superb, with the stage with the TV monitors at the back, which was real cutting edge at the time. Now it's very retro, but it was at the time very futuristic and near future as well. It wasn't the sort of distant science fiction-y stuff. And I think they got into that mode at this period of that dystopian near future, which would come up quite a lot through their music. The band were really working well. Hugh had found his space within the band particularly, I think, and it's a couple of his best songs are on this record. Although it's not one of my favourites, Silver Machine was what got me into the band, so it is very important to me. And I was that sort of, this is a bit clunky. I wouldn't hate it if it was by another band, but I just think that was a bit filler for me. And again, I know people that like it. Fahrenheit 451 doesn't work. I think the vocals don't fit with the music. It just sounds like it's jammed on there. And for years and years and years, I thought that this isn't really working. And why is he singing it like that? And of course, finally, the Bob Calvert version came out earlier this year, was it, on the big box set? And he's singing it pretty much the same, and it works. And you just think, well, what is wrong there? Why does it sound so stilted? And I think it is because of the rigidity of the backing, whereas Dave's singing it around the rhythm. And it works when the band's playing on that demo that Bob did all those years ago. And I don't think it appeared in the live set. I don't think I recall hearing it live. And it would have been interesting to hear it live to see if it took on a bit more of a coherence, but for me that's a bit awkward. Whereas with my enthusiasm for things early German, I do like Void City, that people don't really talk about very much, but it's got that sort of motoric sort of thing. It's just repetitive and off you go in this nice little groove.
Cannot stand Void City. I remember going off on one on the pod.
That was a classic Matt rant.
Yeah, well, I thought I'd speak up for it here, that it's got that Berlin 1973 or something.
That's the thing though, isn't it? Because, you know, if you want to get into it, you've got to get out of it. So the fun thing about Silver Machine on this, Oz, is that we did a special for Silver Machine, because of course it's not on the studio albums, and we're, for the most part, we're doing studio albums. So I just took it for granted that Silver Machine is Silver Machine. And of course, Matt hadn't really heard Silver Machine. So Matt joined the podcast. We had a very narrow escape when Matt realized his mistake not long before we recorded. But there was a good chance that we were going to come on the podcast to talk about the original Silver Machine, and Matt would be talking about the one that he found on Spotify. And Matt's opinion was, wow, that's really forward thinking. So yes, it's interesting how you find these things without the background. So this is interesting because we're jumping around the albums in a nice random way, which I'm kind of enjoying given that Hawkbinge does them all in a linear way. You talked about Levitation and obviously the keyboards on Levitation and how kind of wonderful they are. We talked about Levitation as being Hawkwind's Galactico album because in that 5-piece band, 3 of them are just absolute maestros at what they do. In Hugh Lord-Langton, Tim Blake, and Ginger Baker, none of them are tinkerers and experimenters and just getting sounds out of things. They're all just absolutely brilliant at what they do, which changes Hawkwind quite dramatically on that album. That's the listen to this using headphones, first time being recorded in a certain way album. Yeah. It's incredibly slick. And I've always loved that album, and Matt liked it too. But it was interesting, Matt, your view on that album was that you really liked it, but you were quite glad it was the only one like that they did, right?
There wasn't really a bad track on it. I mean, Prelude is not a track, so I'll ignore that. But, you know, like Space Chase, I absolutely loved. Who's Gonna Win the War is a fantastic track with Brock actually singing his little heart out, which it was really, really nice to hear because sometimes he can be a little bit inconsistent. Charmingly so, but this one you needed to nail it to get that feeling. World of Tears and Psychosis, even, like, I think there's so many tracks that I remember on that. You know, sometimes I look at them again and go, what was that again? But every track on Levitation I completely remember and would happily listen to again. This is very well done, and to your point, I don't want Hawkwind to be that well done because I worry they'll lose some of their edge. Whether or not it's true or whether or not I'm making it up, I feel like they overcompensated for some of their maybe musical drawbacks at the beginning by throwing everything else at the experience. And I didn't want them to just become a band because then you lose a lot of that. And actually Levitation in a way has fewer of those things in it. You know, I would say things like Who's Gonna Win the War? They still got something to say. They're still happy to put themselves out there, but it doesn't quite have the same clever bits and completely insane ideas. You know, it is a lot more well packaged, and I was worried maybe that the quality of the players meant that they didn't want to touch too much of the weirdness. So I'm glad that it's there. I'm glad that they could prove that musically they knew what they were doing and their sound works when you put it up onto a pedestal. But I'm glad that they broke apart a little bit and then reformed themselves in various other ways to make the rest of the albums, because I don't know if you would have got some of the more interesting tracks that we get with this lineup. You know, would you have got Some People Never Die from this band? Probably not. You know, would you have got Wastelands of Sleep, Mutation Zone? Unlikely again, I would say. But what they have done here is just take some wonderful ideas, add some fantastic music to it, and give yourself an album that really feels like it absolutely crosses that 70s to 80s transfer without missing a beat. So yeah, I would argue that the whole of the Hawkwind 80s discography is bookended by 2 really different but really standout albums for almost completely different reasons.
It's interesting, Oz, isn't it? In that a lot of Hawkwind seems to me to exist in little 3-4 album eras of sound lineup concept. But Levitation is a 1 album era, isn't it?
Yeah, because by the time they did the tour, it was a handful of gigs and Tim had gone. Because I remember going to St Austell on that tour, and it's like, who's that guy on the keyboards? And I was expecting to see the band that I'd seen the previous summer, but with Ginger Baker instead of Simon King. But already and I think they had about 3 different keyboard players on there. I was saying earlier on before we started that I found a bunch of tickets the other day. I saw a couple of gigs on the Levitation tour, and I can only remember one of them. I have no idea about that. Taunton. It's a ticket that's being used, and it was a few days after St Austell, but I don't remember it. I presume the same keyboard player was there, Keith Hale, who did a reasonable job, but it was a very different sound. So already the band's sort of doing something else by the time they're touring the album. So yeah, it was a very odd period. I see it very much as the end point of the 70s in some way, because the album before this was Live 79, but came out in the 80s, and you've got the studio versions of the tracks like Motorway City and Dust of Time hadn't been out before, but they'd been playing that live. And that had really developed through live performance. And I think it's just an absolute masterpiece on the album. And Levitation had been appearing in the segueing from Silver Machine as the encore. And so it's the combination of the Hugh Lloyd Langton joining band, I think, really, and that period with Tim, who it's such a shame that he didn't go on. And every time he joins the band again now, I'm absolutely delighted, because one of my favourite albums is his New Jerusalem from, 78 or something. So it's always a pleasure to have Tim on board. But yeah, it's a band that just did that and then disappeared and went into entirely different directions, which he was always going to with Ginger Baker, because if he wasn't going to impose his gingerness upon it, it was going to go somewhere else. No one drums like Ginger Baker, and no one's tried with Hawkwind before or since. So that gives it a completely different texture.
Is it a texture that you like? Where do you stand on the Hawkwind and Ginger Baker debate?
I think the album's superb, and he does a brilliant job on it. Once we got to the drum solo in Brainstorm Live, I was like, oh, for God's sake, not this. I thought I've gone beyond the era of the drum solo, but we hadn't. And there he was thrashing away, and it's one of those things, it's very clever. He can hit things really quickly. Good. I'm very happy for him. But I've always liked the electronic depth of Hawkwind's music, and when all that stops and there's just someone whacking things, it's not for me. Brilliant though he was, it's not the sort of music that I was interested in.
So it's kind of a wonderful one-off, which we kind of need it to be, but not keep being that as we go forward.
I don't think there was anywhere that framework could have gone, really. Because he was essentially a session drummer to put in the drum parts and do the tour, and he's not a session drummer. Someone knows someone, in he goes, but he wasn't going to be around as part of that band without changing it radically, which of course was why he was given the boot.
Absolutely. So in jumping around these albums, we've kind of almost worked our way backwards. And Matt, as you said, Levitation and Xenon Codex bookend the 1980s quite neatly. So if we do jump forward to Xenon Codex was the first one that I bought new on the day of release. Black Sword was the first one I bought while it was the current album, but it was about a year and a half, at least, after it came out that I became aware of it and bought it. Without the internet, I didn't really have any way of knowing what was going to be released when. God, that makes me sound old, but there you go. But then Xenon Codex, by that time, I was into it enough to know that there was an album coming out, know what day it was going to be released on, and go to A&M Records in Shoreham by Sea and pick it up on the day and play it. It was a fun tour with them wearing the lab coats and stuff, and I had a good time, but it wasn't one that I really revisited Xenon Codex until we did the podcast, which means it had sat in the record collection for 30 years or something. But on the re-listen, I really like it. I think it's really strong. But you're more Black Sword than Xenon Codex, I'm guessing, Oz.
I think I am. There's some stuff on Xenon Codex that I really like, and I think it's an album that, again, Hugh Lloyd Langton's astounding throughout. I think his guitar playing is probably the best thing about it, really. I think it's wonderful on there. And the things that I really like, Sword of the East sounds big and chunky and so on. And I think Wastelands of Sleep just drifts beautifully, and I really do like that. Tides, of course, lovely. but, chopping up bits of Kurt Vonnegut and shouting them over the top of a riff isn't really lyric writing as far as I'm concerned. Good evening. It's one that maybe we won't listen to the end of this album.
Yeah, Matt's very happy that it's the last track on the album because he doesn't have to skip it.
Does angle grind it off the record?
Yeah, in the days of vinyl, it was particularly handy that you just sort of lift that off without being in danger of scratching anything worthwhile on there. It struck me that for the most part, no one's really trying on this album. And there's something a little bit muddy about it. And again, after that really clean sort of sounding stuff at the start, this is getting into the sludgy, I think. Because it was actually done in Rockfield, wasn't it? It's coming back to me now. And it was down at Rockfield. But it just doesn't sound as good as it ought to. It hasn't got the dynamics. It's just a bit squished into a sludge in the middle for me, apart from Hugh's guitar coming out at times and really giving it that sort of colour. I think it's running out of ideas. And I think it's a shame because they were so good live at this point.
So out of interest, and this is a small spoiler alert for Matt who hasn't heard this, but Matt will have forgotten this completely by the time we get to it, because we are eventually going to end up doing some of the solo albums and things when we finish the studio run. But given that we're at 1980, we've got a lot to do for the studio run before we get this far. So around this time, of course, there's the Dave solo album, Agents of Chaos. And there's a couple of these tracks are on Agents of Chaos. Are you familiar with that, with Dave's solo album?
Yeah, although I must be honest, that is not one that I've listened to in a while, because no one would have thought they would ever get Dave's solo acoustic album with him playing guitar and singing. And I do remember at a gig once somewhere backstage at the time of the unplugged things saying, Dave, ever thought of doing an unplugged one? Oh, no way. And of course, years later, we get the little acoustic session. And I was so delighted to hear that because, he's a very good acoustic guitarist and so on. And I was hoping the solo album would be that, whereas it's got a lot more in common with something like Church of Hawkwind. And you've got that sense that here's Dave knocking out ideas for songs which became fuller later on or just ended there. So, yeah, I'm terrible on dates. And, of course, I had to look what was in the 80s before this because I don't experience time in a linear fashion. And I was certain that Space Bandits was 89, but no, it was 90. So I'm not sure what other solo things and sideways projects were in the 80s. But certainly Dave's early solo stuff was just, that sort of largely electronic, sketchy thing. That was almost like his stuff that I'll see if it's worth taking to the band later, I suppose. And I'd love more things from the vaults. Some people say we don't want anything more from the vaults. We've already spent £4,000 on reissues this year. But I'd love some late 80s live sets to come out in proper shiny quality, just to show what a phenomenal band they were live at this point.
I was going to ask, actually, because we've now pretty much gone through the various albums and ones we like and where they're going. Given your photography that you were doing throughout the 1980s, you must have caught a staggering amount of Hawkwind live shows. I wondered if there was a favourite tour. I assumed it would be Black Sword simply because of the magnitude of it, but is that the case?
Well, I think for me, it was just after that. And again, I don't really do dates. I'm guessing it was 86 that was sort of the Black Sword lineup, but without Nick, which of course suddenly, as soon as you say, and the band without Nick, you get into these big online spats here. I loved the stuff with Nick also. As I said, particularly the flute, it just brought a different dimension and so on. But there was something after they'd gone their separate ways. The band was very, very, very tight. And there was a sense there, I think, that they were sort of revisiting things they hadn't done for a number of years. And you get things like 7x7 or Paradox in the set and so on. And Paradox remains my favourite Hawkwind track. And they were just such good gigs. And there were lots of releases that were quite bitty things like Zones and, Out and Intake and Live Chronicles. But a good solid gig would be wonderful for me. And so, yeah, that sort of 86, I guess, was my peak of the 80s.
Which was when I started seeing them live. I was obviously very fortunate to get my initial Hawkwind gigs at a time where they were on form.
I think they were on for most of the 80s live. Just the bit when Tim went and they had to draft in Keith, and then was a guy, Twink, wasn't it, who's not the drummer Twink, but the other Twink who was with, I think, Here and Now for a bit, who I didn't see because I think he was there for about a fortnight or something, just drafting people in to cover the space. For me, that didn't work. But apart from that, and there were a lot of odd little gigs through the 80s as well. You know, obviously the Stonehenge ones, some of which have had at least semi-official issues on, with the Black Widow thing from 83, was it that one, or 84? I can't remember. But those odd little things like the first C-Con with Bob and Hugh and Harvey and Dave doing a largely electronic set, which appears not to have been recorded by anyone because it would have surfaced by now. And the electronica thing with Harvey, Dave and Nick and so on, which has appeared on YouTube, I see. All these little things, and you get a guest spot from Bob and so on. And it bring a little bit of chaos, a bit of the unexpected to a very tight core band. It was a great time to see them, I think. And obviously you're going to get into the 90s, but it sort of narrows down to a smaller band for a long time. But the 80s, there was a lot of coming and going, which I think, while perhaps it's not everyone's favourite era for some aspects of the band, I think it kept it very exciting live.
Very much so. So, Matt, we've come to the end of the decade, and a decade following early 70s particularly is such a colourful, like the psychedelic element of it. It feels like Hawkwind. And then we kind of remarked on it with, I'm going to now say it for the third time, the Thatcher era. And the 1980s is much more dull by comparison to the colourful 70s. That's probably not literally true. That's just the way that my brain is working. But there's a lot of really good stuff that Hawkwind actually put out through the 80s, right?
Yeah, and I feel like they've got their stuff that they like returning to. I feel like there was probably more cultural criticism in the 70s. I feel like there's probably less of that in the 80s. However, with things like Who's Going to Win the War and even War I Survived to maybe a lesser extent, they're still talking about combat. I would say maybe even with the space rock stuff, their sinister ideas go forward facing rather than backwards looking, or even just like looking right down at where they are. You know, if we have ideas about brains in jars, things from the 70s about automatons and robots and stuff have come forward into this ideas, you know, where we have things like the idea of the sleeper, which goes into your brain, and people who harvest dreams, and even the whole of Fall of Earth City, which is basically a whole story about humanity done screwed up. I think that there's still some of that theme stuff. It's just not societarily relevant in the same way. It's more gone into allegory and lamentations, as we like to say, of the human condition. It's not so much right now is bad. I still think that they carry quite a few of their themes across into this decade. It's just quite different in terms of the way that they deliver it. And I think maybe, again, that might be because of the musicality a little bit, where they don't always go super experimental because they can actually throw a tune together. And I'm sure when the pressure's on, that's easier to do in a way than find something experimental that is then both cool and worth putting on a tape. So I think that you're right, that it is a bit transformative in that way. But I do feel that even though the Xenon Codex is a little all over the place, there's more imagination in that album per track than most of the other albums, just in terms of sheer abandon of what they're talking about. You know, we talked about The War I Survived. Sure, it's a book, but, you know, they didn't have to look at a book. They didn't have to be inspired by something weird and talk about, you know, like time-traveling World War II veterans, but they do. Wastelands of Sleep is someone who may or may not be conscious, talking about the fact that, you know, maybe he can't get any rest anymore and what that does to people. Heads is Heads and completely insane. Mutation Zone is what I would call, you know, like the RoboCop dystopian song. And then, you know, things like Good Evening, despite being an absolute pile of garbage, is at least an attempt to do something, I guess. There's some stuff in there which is not them retreading, it's them taking apart and putting back together. I think I actually maybe appreciate the 80s a lot more being able to marathon it. I feel like maybe living as a Hawkwind fan in the 80s and seeing what comes might be challenging. But the fact I can literally blitz through the whole thing and be like, oh yeah, that was good, done, cool, that was a fun decade. But I can do that in an afternoon. The fact that you have to live the whole time and then see what's coming out and you're like, oh, that wasn't what I wanted. All right, better luck next year. You know, I think when you look back on it, it's actually an interesting body of work. Even though I feel like, yeah, in real time, I'm sure it was a much different way of experiencing it all.
That must have been interesting living through it in real time. I didn't start living Hawkwind in real time really until after Black Sword. So the 90s is me living through Hawkwind in real time. But people, I think, Oz, who are of the I stopped listening at Levitation brigade, of which there are one or two, are missing out on some really good stuff.
I think so. A couple of things just picking up on what Matt was saying, that sort of living in real time, because of course when you're living in real time, you're getting all the gigs in between as well. And you're getting what I think we can still call the counterculture, even though it's attached very much to the 70s, that idea, this sort of alternative culture in the 80s. They were very much a sort of a rallying point. I think one of those sort of combative songs that wasn't mentioned, of course, is Choosy Masques as well. Very much an us and them sort of song. And there was a real sense of that about the band, whatever the lyrics are about. And of course, if you've got a free festival in the 80s, Hawkwind are there, and they're playing on that stage and they're playing on that stage, and they may be on the main stage, but they're in someone's tent at 4 o'clock in the morning as well, possibly with different musicians around the core and so on. So they're very much, I think, a sort of countercultural force. And of course, you've got bands that they're influencing coming in varying kinds coming off that, people like Magic Mushroom Band and Osric Tentacles and so on, all these festival bands, and all the ones who are on the Traveller's Aid Trust album, which is probably into the early 90s, is it that? But they're the bands that were playing with them alongside, and indeed members who were coming across into the 90s, people like Richard and Bridget and so on. So they're very much continuing the cultural importance to a certain group of people who are perhaps in some ways getting more marginalised during the Thatcher years. The Beanfield, of course, is the famous confrontation, but it's the same era as the miners' strikes, which of course Bob's referring to on his solo album at the time as well. So there's a lot of things going on that are perhaps not reflected as much in the lyrics of some of the albums that are coming out at that time, but I think they're very much as a very socially involved band at that period still, as you're living through it from time to time. And the studio albums were just one aspect of that at the time. And of course, it's the aspect that we've got now that we can sort of take out and put on or download or whatever we're doing. But that is just part of a larger energy, I think, that's coming out of the band at the time.
And of course, there was a recent live box set from the 80s. It's Dreamworkers of Time. I'm guessing that that's kind of cleaned up and remastered. There's some BBC stuff on there, isn't there?
Yeah, it's all BBC stuff, yeah.
Yes, that's the one. So there's some good stuff there. So there you go, people. If you are Hawkwind fans, but you haven't really dipped into the 80s much recently and got your Thatcher era fix of the Hawks, then do so, because there's some gems in there. So that's the 80s, and we have all looked at those 80s albums, and there are tracks that have come to light that were recorded at that time and for whatever reason did not make their way onto the official studio releases. Either they were demos, B-sides, things that have surfaced later. And just like we did with Joe at the end of the 1970s, we have picked 3 each. These will appear on a playlist. And Oz, as our incredibly special guest, we gave you first picked, and you came up with Social Alliance from Zones.
Yeah, it's one of those that didn't make it onto a studio version. There's the Dave Brock solo single, but it was just a great track live, and it goes back to those early days when Nick was just back in the band, and it had a real energy to it, and it'd have a bit where it sort of drifted off and there's some honky sax going on, but not too much of it, and it was just one of those tracks that came and went, and there are those occasionally in all eras that I just think that deserves a bit of a revisiting, and I don't think it has been subsequently, but it's a great track worth going back and having a listen to.
Nice. And we'll put that up there. And Matt, you chose one of the tracks from Masques, Radio Telepathy.
Yeah, I really like this track. For me, it could have been an album track. The experimentation of the drum machines is in full effect at the start, with this very electronic sounding kick and hi-hat, into which this fuzzy, crunchy bass line fades up and we get this really nice sinister tone. The whole atmosphere of the track is really foreboding. You know, it feels like the darkest, grimiest streets of Blade Runner's LA mixed with the isolation of Dread's mega tower block, you know, so I feel like the sci-fi-ness is really hitting big on this one. And the pressure of the track is this very low boil, but by the end of the track, it's almost crushing you, this whole atmosphere of it. And there's waves of just pure guitar distortion, these long droning chords and almost atonal synth textures. And then when this digital hi-hat starts ticking over the top, you get this almost time bomb feel to the piece, which it's just tension on tension on tension, which is amazing for me. I think the lyrics are really well delivered. It actually reminds me of George Carlin's A Man for the Millennium, which is his little bit of beat poetry when he's talking about being a thoroughly modern man. He's describing himself in this satirical way as this perfect encapsulation of the times, but I feel like he's doing that kind of George Carlin idea, but in a more abstract way, which I think is really cool. It actually reminded me a bit of the COVID lockdowns, you know, or those Japanese teenagers who never leave their apartments and do everything fully remote because they've given up on society and they've just embraced the internet completely. I think there's even like a word for them. I don't remember the name now, but these lines have this creepy level of prescience to them. You know, I'm a digital citizen, all safe in my room, and I've got my video to relieve my gloom. I mean, if that wasn't lockdown for most people, then, you know, probably you were doing it wrong. But, you know, I think that's kind of amazing. And I love how at the end of the track, we have this little strummy, like desert rock vibe to round us out, and then we fade back into obscurity. But I feel like it's just a really awesome, creepily prescient bit of like Hawkwind imagination again. So I'm surprised it didn't make it onto an album, but for me it's absolutely glorious.
Well, it'll make it onto our playlist. My first pick, relatively simple one, Transdimensional Man, which was a B-side. An interesting thing about this is this isn't like an unused track or a demo or something unfinished or an alternate version of something. It's a fully formed, finished song that they just didn't stick on the album, and I don't really know why. It's an interesting one, Oz.
Well, it's Speed of Light off Sonic Attack. It's an alternative take on a familiar track, you know, and of course it's something the band's done a lot over the years of these sort of different versions around things. It's too similar to make an album track, but an excellent B-side, and yeah, good call on that one. I'd forgotten that.
Me too. You picked one to go alongside Matt's Radio Telepathy, also from the Choose Your Masques extension, which is Oscillations.
Yeah, I love it when Dave does his distant, lost in space, drifting about voice, and I could just listen to things like Infinity and so on. And I think this is a classic, lost, distant, melancholy Dave vocal, just treated beautifully, the sound around it. And it's, yeah, I absolutely love that sound that appears occasionally on the Hawkwind albums. And I could, you know, do a playlist of a whole load of those. I just think magic.
That sounds like a good playlist, actually. Matt, the next one on our playlist is your next pick, which is Running Through the Backbrain, which you can find on Zones.
Yeah, a live track. How about that? Me
go.
Picking a live track. How times have changed. I like this one though because it feels like quote unquote classic Hawkwind with a kind of spacey, groovy vibe. The whole track's more like a groove poem in a way, with a full rhyming story and the word messages repeated over and over and over, which is very reminiscent of some of those 70s tracks where they just repeat words like ad nauseum or until they don't make any sense and they just become a noise. Maybe because this is on the Zones thing, maybe it makes a bit more sense because it's closer to the 70s. But still, I thought it was nice that it carried over. But it's got this lovely groove to it. It's got these very tentative Rhodesy keys. They make the backbone of the piece, which the lyrics and the guitar use as a kind of like lighthouse to be able to run off and explore a bit, but they always know when to come back to provide some overall cohesion to everything. I think, despite me calling it a groove poem, the lyrics aren't amazing. Some of them feel quite forced, and they have some of those very lazy rhymes. Rhyming pants with larynx is a particular egregious combo. That's getting to fondue levels of, like, really. But there are some really lovely ones as well, like my brother and my sister join the army. They promise that they do not mean to harm me. And the track just gets increasingly fractious and intense with every chorus. What started with this relaxed backbeat of a drum line starts to add fills. The space bit gets more busy with percussion. The repetition of messages starts to get more maniacal. The speaker at the end starts to even second guess themselves in their story, asking, for example, like, sounds are getting stranger, warning me of danger, or is it that I'm merely tired? You know, there's this whole feeling of someone who's just spinning out. There's even a talk about a killer who seems to be maybe another character, but we don't know if he's trying to kill the speaker. I get the impression maybe they're just a dangerous force, so I don't feel like I've fully worked this out yet. But overall, while the story is a little haphazard in places, the track carries itself wonderfully, and I think when the crowd give it up at the end, I find myself doing the same. So a good bit of Hawkwind live there.
Nice work. And my second is The End of Earth City, which is obviously the demo of Fall of Earth City from Sonic Attack. It's a bit like the story of Sonic Attack, where actually a number of different people had a go at Sonic Attack before they settled on Harvey. And I can see the Fall of Earth City being one that people just had a go at. And to be honest, I like the Fall of Earth City enough that I would be prepared to listen to many alternate versions of different voiceovers with different backings, because it's just something that I'm happy to be absorbed in. The story, I like the kind of storytelling. It's not so literal that you know exactly what's going on. It's kind of ethereal enough that you can create some quite nice visions yourself for what's going on. So it's not that I think this is better than Fall of Earth City, which appears on the album, but it's just another really nice take on it. Oz, your last one is the live track, They've Got Your Number, which is the one that's appeared on Dreamworkers of Time. This is Hugh, isn't it?
It is, yeah, and it's one of his solo tracks that got incorporated into the Hawkwind set for a while, and it worked really well. You know, obviously, I like Hugh as a guitarist enormously. I think his solo albums quite often suffer from underproduction, but there's some great material on them. And it was really nice to hear the full band play this live, which they didn't do for very long. So it was a real joy when I saw that the box set was coming out of the BBC stuff, that this had actually been finally getting the Hawkwind release after all this time. So it was really good to be able to pick that from an official release rather than saying, well, find a dodgy live tape somewhere and listen to this one. It's a great, straightforward rock song in that sort of paranoia and so on within it, and the slightly menacing quality really fit into that sort of mid-80s Hawkwind set. It really worked in there, and it's good to have it officially released at last.
Could not agree more. And Matt, you've also gone for a live bonus track from Xenon Codex, Ejection.
Yeah, I think this is a Calvert track, or Calvert was involved. It feels Calvert-y.
It's from Captain Lockheed and the Starfighters.
God damn it. Now I need to listen to it, because I was going to say it feels like it was clearly a Calvert track, and it's also one of Hawkwind's most punky tracks I've ever heard them do, possibly more punky than anything that's on an album that I've heard so far. And while the intro is clearly Calvert's oddness at work, I don't mind it on this for some reason, maybe because it's short enough or just weird enough that I don't mind it so much. You know, I think the whole thing with Captain Lockheed is it's so long that I just find it tedious, but this little bit is kind of cool. It reminds me of Experiment Number 6 by Lemon Jelly, which has this doctor administering a random medication to a subject, which I always quite liked, this idea of just someone talking, and it just puts you in a strange place before you go out into the track. So I think it does that bit very nicely, somehow just building some kind of strange thing. And at the end, I just like the fact it just says glass of water. When the kick comes in, there's something about that which is very gratifying. But yeah, anyway, there's a cool bass line under all of that, which helps to carry everything along. Big kick drum comes to hype you up, and then it breaks into this energetic, thrashy number with very punky delivery of the vocals as well. Like, even everyone coming together to shout ejection has that feeling that it would just send a dance floor crazy, which is very cool. I like that this doesn't have the kind of wandering, wailing guitar on it that became that Hawkwind staple in the 80s. It gives that a bit of a break and just goes straight for the crowd, which again is nice to have that whole range that Hawkwind's capable of. And, you know, it goes a bit more spacey towards the end, but it's still very staccato and jittery, so that energy's still there. And it kind of resolves back into this jump up vibe before it wraps itself up neatly. It's just good fun, and I wanted another good fun track, because I think sometimes some of the best times I have with Hawkwind is when they remember that they can just make a pit jump around a bit. Considering how much we know Hawkwind were in the punk scene, I was surprised how few tracks sound like this that they made, but I didn't need them to sound like this ever, really. But the fact that they can prove that they can do it puts them in that space, which I really like.
Fantastic. And the final track, my last pick, is the Hugh singing of Psychedelic Warlords, which is a bonus on Choose Your Masques. And I do not in any way prefer this to the original. The original on Hall of the Mountain Grill is one of my favourite Hawkwind tracks of all time. But there is something about Hugh's delivery of the vocals that I really like. I saw him do this live with his own group in a pub in Brighton, and I like Hugh's version of it. The drums are annoying. They are the most 80s sounding drums of all time. But it's just Hugh's delivery of the words I really like. So I can listen to this one and be pretty happy. And actually, I prefer this alternate version of Psychedelic Warlords than I do the alternate version of
Silver Machine.
Silver Machine. God damn it.
You know that one.
Honestly, that's quite famous, isn't it? That track of Silver Machine that actually made the record. So there will be a playlist containing Social Alliance, Radio Telepathy, Transdimensional Man, Oscillations, Running Through the Back Brain, The End of Earth City, They've Got Your Number, Ejection, and Psychedelic Warlords. That's a pretty eclectic mix coming your way, as selected by myself and by Matt and by the legend that is Oz Hardwick. Oz, what are you doing next? 2022 was a huge year. Where do we find you working next?
Well, I'm just sent off the manuscript of an anthology on ekphrastic poetry, co-edited by myself and Cassandra Atherton, which of course is poetry that responds to artworks in various ways. It's got nearly 60 writers from around the world. The reason why I can get away with mentioning it here, though, is that my own poem and discussion of the process is written in response to Electronic Number 1 of Space Ritual. So I've written a poem relating to that. I've also shortly got an article in an academic journal coming out, mainly on writing in response to Pink Floyd, but with Hawkwind in there as well. So that Hawkwind is sneaking into my academic work a bit at the moment, which is kind of fun. I can get away with that sort of thing at my age.
Will you be teaching next year's students about the ability to rhyme pants and larynx?
I think that might well come up as rhymes to avoid.
Well, we will be recording again very soon. Space Bandits is on the horizon. Hawkbinge is back in almost full force, or whatever approaching full force we were ever in. Season 3 will begin. This is our end of Season 2. Oz, it has been amazing to spend so much time with you. Quite brilliant, and hopefully we'll find an excuse to have you back on at some point in the future and maybe talk about those things that you've just said that you're working on that come out fairly soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, and prepare everyone for Blast Off for Season 3, and we will see you all then.
You've been listening to Hawkbinge. It was devised and presented by Andy Hood and Matt Longstaff. The soundtrack was produced by Don Music Presents. To contact the show, drop us a message on Instagram, Facebook or Twitter by searching @Hawkbinge, or send an email to podcast@hawkbinge.space. Hawkbinge is part of the Deep Dive Podcast Network. To find more great band-focused podcasts like this one, head to @DeepDivePodNet on Twitter and dive in. Thank you as always for listening. We'll see you next time. We have strange fantasy ideas about man-wolves, like, no, wait a second, that's 70s, isn't it? I'll edit that bit. So, my podcast.